All right, welcome. So, today the lesson is going to be over traffic patterns, generally just how to fly them and why they exist. And then it'll only take about 10 minutes, and then we will go up and fly it and demonstrate it, and you'll get to see what I'm talking about. So, just to start off, we've got some learning objectives. First one is have a basic understanding of why a traffic pattern exists. Secondly, have a basic understanding of the parts of a traffic pattern. Third, how to enter, fly, and depart a traffic pattern. And finally, understand the standard procedures for towered and non-towered operations. That's what will be covered in today's lesson, and hopefully you'll absorb all that. But if not, we've got some homework. Um, Equipment. So I've got some training aids today. I'll be supplying them on my iPad if they will focus. So just for example, right there. And yeah, I don't have a whiteboard. Otherwise, I'd use that. But for now, the iPad will do. Um, we'll just get right into it. So, what is a traffic pattern? A traffic pattern is a rectangular shaped circuit around the runway, um, as seen right here. So, just rectangle around, pretty simple, and we'll be flying a lot of them. So, hopefully, you'll get a great understanding by the end of today's lesson and further that with more flying. So, why do we have traffic patterns? Just get right into it. Separate aircraft generally to create a orderly flow for both towered and non-towered airports. When you have everyone coming in from different directions, all trying to get to the same point on the runway, it can be really hectic and it can be really difficult to watch out for traffic, especially when they're coming in from, like I said, so many different directions, different speeds on aircraft, and it can be really hard to communicate over the radios, like, oh, I'm this distance from here, or it just becomes a lot simpler. Just saying, oh, I'm going to be entering a downwind, rather than trying to describe your relation to the airport. So, additionally, it is to keep aircraft away from noise sensitive areas and things along those lines. So you can, airport management, things along those lines can set a traffic pattern to one side of the runway or another because, say a school is on the other side of the runway, or, a city, when the other side of the runway is fields. So keeping them away from noise sensitive areas can really help. So, parts of a traffic pattern. Now, there are five main parts to a traffic pattern. There's the upwind. So, right here on the graphic, the upwind is you take off from the runway and basically you're flying the upwind. Secondly, we have the crosswind. So, you take off from the runway, you fly your upwind, and then that first turn you're going to make is called the crosswind. And that crosswind extends into the downwind. And then as you come around, the base is the turn right before you turn to final. So this is just the names for the rectangular pattern. And so it's pretty simple, but can be confusing at times. Now, in addition, let's go ahead and get up another infographic right up here, just to give you another look at what we're seeing. So, the reason downwind is called a downwind is you're typically flying with the direction of the wind, whereas when you want to land, you typically want to fly into the wind. The reason for that is you don't want to land with a tailwind because your ground speed is going to be much higher, your landing distance is going to be much higher, and generally it's never fun. You can, overspeed the gear, pop tires, things along those lines, or just have a super long landing and maybe even go off the end of the runway. I've landed with slight tailwinds and just, a few knots. You really, really notice the difference. It can get hairy. Sometimes jets do it, but that's only because they have to. So, basic rules of the traffic pattern. So we'll start off standard. The direction of turn is going to be a left turn in the pattern. Just that's what you typically do, but keep in mind that that's just standard. It doesn't mean that you'll never have to make right turns. On certain airports, such as let's see, Boulder, right here, you can see on the sectional, this RP means right pattern, and it's for 26 and 26 Golf. So those are the runway numbers on the sectional, and it'll tell you, a right pattern for those runways. Keep in mind, it typically says on the sectional, or you can look in the chart supplement. That'll be great to find, airport information. So before you go to an airport, especially one that you haven't been to before, but always is a good option, check your chart supplement, get all available information that you can. So, we talked a little bit about the wind direction and picking runway. You always want to land and take off into the wind, or as much as you can. A lot of times there's crosswinds, and it's never going to be perfect, but you want to avoid having a tailwind. Now, altitude, another thing that you want to look in the chart supplement for. They typically have that data, but a standard traffic pattern altitude is 1,000 foot over the runway. Now, big jets, things along those lines, large aircraft might fly higher than that, but for general aviation, things along those lines, 1,000 foot is standard. But keep in mind, big jets may not adhere to that because they're flying a much wider pattern, things along those lines. And, for example, when I started flying, I flew at TSTC, and their traffic pattern was only 800 foot above. So not always standard, but you can find that information in the chart supplement. Now you may be asking, okay, that's how high we go, and that's the direction we go, but how fast do we go in the traffic pattern? Do you want to go as fast as possible, or do you want to keep landing speed? Generally, what I go for is 1.5 times your VS1. Now, VS1, I'm sure you're aware of it, is your stall in clean configuration or takeoff configuration. So, for example, in the Cessna 150 that we're flying, stall speed in clean configuration is 54 miles an hour. Now, take 54, multiply it by 1.5, and you get 81 miles an hour. So, we'll be flying the traffic pattern at 81 miles an hour. Somewhere along those lines. It's not, hard set rigid, but that's about the speed that you want to go, just so you're not going super fast, or you're going super slow and not having as much control. In the US, the maximum speed in the pattern is 200 knots. I'm not sure why you would want to go that fast in the pattern, but that's as fast as you can go. And so let's talk about entering a pattern. Now, we talked about what you're going to do if you're just going out and flying the pattern like we are today, but eventually you're going to get up to cross countries or just flying out to the practice area and then coming back to the airport. So you're going to have to learn how to enter the pattern. Now, there's a couple of different ways, and it's not set in stone, it's not rigid, but you want to be ready for these things, and that way when the control tower or traffic is calling it out, you want to be able to understand. So we talked about downwind, the downwind leg. Now there's an entry that is probably the most standard, the most common, which is a 45-degree entry into the downwind leg. Now this is typically done at about the midpoint down the field, so done halfway down the field. That's this entry right here. It's coming in from about a 45-degree angle and entering the downwind leg. That's the most standard. That's probably what you're going to see the most. However, if you're coming from the other side of the airport, um, say if you're coming from over here, well, that 45-degree downwind entry is going to be really out of the way. So what's another option you can do? You can overfly the field, and typically you want to overfly the field at 500 to 1,000 foot above the traffic pattern altitude. You don't want to cross the runway or enter something like that at traffic pattern altitude. So, for example, you come across the runway here. So say traffic pattern is 1,000 feet. You'll come 1,500 to 2,000 feet, and you want to tell everyone that you're doing this. And come circle around, do a 270-degree turn to enter. You don't want to turn just right, for example. You'd be turning right here. You don't want to just turn and enter the traffic pattern because you need to lose that airspeed as well as that time that would take you to turn. You would probably be about ready for your base. And additionally, you don't want to be descending into the traffic pattern altitude because that could be a real collision risk. You want to be at the traffic pattern altitude when you enter. That way, other aircraft can see you. You can see other aircraft. So yeah, that's typically the most standard entries. Sometimes you can just enter into the downwind. Sometimes you have straight in. So for example, you do a straight in approach. You basically just fly right up to the runway. Sometimes tower or in a non-towered environment, you could be doing a left base or a right base to enter and land. If you're kind of coming in from the direction of the runway, you typically don't have to fly a pattern. It's never a bad idea. It always gives you more time to assess and see traffic and things along those lines. A little bit more on almost every airport that I can imagine has a windsock. If the airport doesn't have automated weather, a windsock is your next best way to determine which runway to use. Now in a non-towered airport, say you're coming in from across country, you want to be making a lot of radio calls because there's no one to really keep track of who's all in the traffic pattern and in the airport area. That's your job. So you want to make radio calls about 10 miles and then 5 miles, and then every aspect, everything you're doing in the traffic pattern, downwind, base, final, things like that. You want to make radio calls, and they're real easy. You just say the airport you're flying out of. So for example, Conroe traffic. You'd say Conroe traffic, Cessna 1234 is 10 miles out, Conroe traffic. And you want to say, where you're flying to, the traffic pattern area, both at the beginning and at the end. And that lets people understand what airport, because there's a lot of airports that use the same frequencies that are untowered. Another thing to keep in mind, in uncontrolled airports, there's a lot of guys with old Pipers and things along those lines that don't actually have radios. You don't have to if you're maintaining in a non-radio airport or anything, a Class Golf or Class Echo airspace. You don't have to have a radio. So keep your eye out. Just because you think you hear everyone over the radio and they're making calls doesn't mean everyone has a radio and everything. So always look for more traffic. Always assume that there's one more airplane out there that you haven't found. So that pretty much sums it up. Let's just take a little quiz here. Just pulling it out. And so we have 3 airports here. Tell me which ones have right pattern. Which ones have a left pattern, and if they're all standard traffic pattern heights, how high would they be? All right. So let's start off with this one. So this is Monmouth Executive. This one right here will be a left traffic pattern, and the airport elevation is 153. So that means our traffic pattern altitude would be 1153. This one right here, this one would be a right pattern, as you can see, right pattern for runway 24. So that would be the runway going in this direction if you were to be landing that direction. And its traffic pattern altitude would be 1,087 feet. And then finally, we have this one, which is a right pattern for runway 29, which is this direction. And it would be a 1,118 foot pattern. So, let's see. Any final things? Any questions for me? Things along those lines? Feel free to ask. Now, homework will be Chapter 7 in the Aircraft Flying Handbook. And yeah, that's all. Let's go fly.